We all have legacy applications, business process applications, other things that we use today. And those legacy apps are terrible. And we hope that they're moving away from them over time, right?
Lead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
Now I want to take a pivot and really talk about how Microsoft, by default and by design, makes things more responsible and secure and compliant. So if we take the example earlier of shared channels, and this isn't just for shared channels, it's true for SharePoint, for OneDrive, for email, et cetera. What Microsoft has done from the ground up is when they built this, right, this capability, they made sure that they thought through the various compliance, security, and considerations. We mentioned earlier things like seeing external tagging, but this is actually much more robust than that, right? So the fact that e-discovery and legal holds work across that, the information barriers, which is the idea that I have one in legal, as an example, we have ethical walls, where if you're working on one matter, which is a legal journey, a project, and someone else is working on another matter, and then they say, hey, can you come help me with this matter? If there's a conflict of interest, right, then you're not allowed to do that. So there's all sorts of complex rules for information barriers, for financial organizations and more. But that kind of functionality is built into Microsoft 365. There's options for you to use that. Location-based data and management, retention and DLP, where it's automated and understands things like, hey, this is medical data versus this is, a SSIN or a SIN number, et cetera. Things like a monitoring and auditing being built in, access reviews, like that external identity and how that can be managed, where you can not just enforce MFA, but you can do things like, recycle or life cycle the external identity. There's so much that you can do here. And all of this is built in. Right? When you decide you want to use shared channels, which I hope you do in the near term, when you start to use those, you have to think about all of these things, right? You can't just roll out shared channels and not have at least considered some of these implications, because if you don't have a strategy for these things that I'm mentioning here, then again, fundamentally, you're exposing your organization to incredible risk. Another example that I mentioned here was this idea of compliant by design when it comes to external users. So if you don't know this, you control these settings. So by default, when you go to roll out shared channels, you have to turn on B2B or partner to partner external sharing scenarios, right, where I'm sharing these channels outside of my organization. And yes, shared channels have a lot of value inside an organization, but when you decide to turn that on, I hope you've thought through things like, do we require MFA for all those external identities? I hope you do, right? It's been a big risk for a long time. People have identity leaks all the time. And so if we want to put data that might be sensitive into these shared spaces, we need to make sure that we at least understand that if someone's account is compromised, that doesn't mean necessarily that someone's going to be able to get access to that data, right? They still have to get the account, the person's device, right, the person's thumb or something to unlock the device, et cetera, which is right now at least one of the most effective ways to secure the data within both your own organization and external organizations. Another example here is something like, the policies, right? So who can actually create these shared channels? When we look at these shared channels, do we do things like security attestations? Do we do like check-ins where people on a 6-month basis or whatever the rhythm is from a lifecycle perspective, where they have to validate that these are the right people that should continue to have access, right? Do we do things like that proactively and programmatically as IT to ensure that things are compliant and successful? There's lots of stuff to discuss here. And this story goes on because if you think about individuals, right, and I'm someone who's sharing that channel, or someone's shared that channel with me, there's also ways in which they can be part of that journey, right? They can choose, yeah, absolutely, I should accept the share, or I want to terminate the sharing with other teams. There's a lot of modeling here where the idea is to empower users. Remember, it's responsible empowerment, empower them to make choices, hopefully informed choices on how to manage these things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to. We could do a lot of this programmatically, again, from an IT perspective. Again, the goal is to reduce cost of ownership for IT. The goal is to meet that velocity need that people have. And so that requires us to make sure that team owners and especially specific areas of the business can actually operate in this way without IT support, right? The rest is programmatic and already kind of on by default. one last example. I mentioned that SharePoint on the back end is driving a lot of success for compliance. Well, that's because SharePoint is built up as a content management or content services solution from the ground up. So its core focus is how do we collaborate on files and content, and how do we do that in a secure and compliant way? And so there's a lot to talk about for this. What I want to do is I want to really emphasize this concept of metadata, because metadata has been around for years, but it's very, very important for optimizing collaboration and enabling some of the outcomes we want for information management and process management. So if you don't know this, one form of collaboration that is arguably the best one to improve, like from an ROI perspective, is a process. If you have a process where people have to collaborate, right, approve, review a document, et cetera, when you optimize that process, the outcomes are really easy to measure. How hard was it before? How long did it take? What are the outcomes before as a baseline? What's changed since then? And then you just, rationalize what the potential impact of that has been monetarily. So if we take something as simple as metadata, adding metadata to libraries and places and having that represented within our team's experiences, that's certainly a good starting point. But what you really want to do is you want to take this even further. The idea shouldn't be, hey, I'm going to ask everyone to fill out a bunch of metadata. I'm adding friction, which is going to do the opposite of what we want. It's not going to allow us to have greater volume of collaboration. It's certainly not going to help with velocity of collaboration. We don't want to add friction. So how could we do this? Well, one way to potentially do this is to do it by default. So if I have an HR site, it's a project site. I know that it relates to HR, right? So it's an HR project site. I know that because I created it, or you know that because you're a part of that site. We know that this relates to HR. So why not have it be that the site is department equals HR, and that department equals HR is applied to all the content by default in the site. If I drag and drop a document in the site, it will inherit department equals HR. If I add a news or event to the site, it'll have department equals HR. This will help with roll-up and with search, a bunch of other experiences, but most importantly, it will allow us to do things like say, hey, all the HR content, whether it's in project sites, departmental portals, et cetera, all the HR content in the organization, we want to apply this kind of retention rule, we want to apply this kind of data sensitivity rule, et cetera. This is important because that's how you scale and sustain information management at scale. Default values where we know the container, right, this workspace, that we know things about this workspace, like it relates to a product, a department, et cetera, and we inherit those metadata points there. This has been available from a functional perspective in Microsoft SharePoint for 10 plus years. You have been able to do this, default values of metadata, for 10 years. People still don't use it. This is a big flaw. And the beauty of this is you actually don't need to expose the metadata at all. You don't even need to show users that you're capturing this metadata. It can just be, I'm working in Teams, I drag and drop my files, I'm sharing them, and because I'm putting them in the team is automatically applying all this metadata, which again empowers governance and information management much more. If you take something as simple as a label, right? Labels have two mechanisms in Microsoft 365. There's a concept of a retention label, and there's a concept of a sensitivity label. The retention labels, essentially the magic of them is that we can have a trigger condition after X amount of time where it now triggers a disposition flow. And then from there, it can maybe apply a new label. It can, delete the content. It can move the content to an archive. It can do a bunch of different things. So the idea here is that we have content that we need to manage the lifecycle of, and we use labels to do that. Here's the thing. There are ways to automate label application, and I'll talk about them. But at the end of the day, if you've managed your content, right, these spaces, especially if you know department equals HR on this content, you're much more empowered to have a much more effective and programmatic label strategy than having to require people to individually label things or to have like some sort of other automation tool that has a lot of false positives and other risks. So I'll talk about the gaps in automation, but it's important to understand you need metadata to have an effective label strategy. Yes, labels is one part of the metadata, but it can be based on correlation, right? If this metadata of department and this is the product, then this should be the retention label. Those are things you can do with content types and other types of targeting rules with labels today. All right, another example of a label is sensitivity. This is important because it stops things like, copy, paste, print, things like watermarking and much more. So sensitivity is really important to protect key content, and it's also something that we should be leveraging in association with metadata. and processes. So let's talk about the value of this. The more we use metadata, especially the example I gave of a really easy one, which is default metadata, that means that when people do searches, we can enable them to filter and refine all of that search content based on metadata. We can even have specialized search experiences like this example of a policy center or a procedure center, or other kinds of common documents across the organization, contracts, you name it. And then we can enable people to filter that content, even if that content's stored in many places. So if you take the example of a procedure, we might have procedures that are IT, we might have procedures and policies that are HR, we might have ones that are finance, right? So they're actually stored in each of those departmental locations. But what we can do is we can create a unified search experience very easily, by the way, that aggregates that content and then allows us to quickly filter based on department or based on other attributes. So this is why those metadata pieces are so important, not just for the back end, right, for governance and information management, but also even for end user experiences. Another great example of this is how Caligo works. So if you don't know this, I mentioned earlier, and I've really focused on Teams. There are two main applications people use, Outlook and Teams. Well, Caligo allows us to use Outlook and connect it to the rest of this collaboration journey. One of the problems with Outlook is often we send emails back and forth with files and other things, and it's siloed, right? It's you and me. It's very particular people that are included on that. And yes, sometimes organizations are smart enough to add like a CC that adds it to a group or a team or things like that. But we know that there's always going to be exceptions to that rule. And so for a lot of reasons, you would want to use something like Caligo Email Manager because it makes the filing, right, the actual transition of taking this content from a me, which is my Outlook, to a we or us version, right, of the file, very easy, right? It allows me to quickly file that. What's more, if I do it, then I also inherit all those compliance rules and all of those sensitivity and protection rules that we mentioned earlier. What's more, it's not even just for what I've described, even the ability to potentially assign labels within the experience of Outlook becomes really valuable. If I know that something isn't just that I want to store it within this team as an example, and I want to have that content digested there and stored there, but I actually know that this is actually very sensitive, then I might apply a label individually for that as an exception. Because yes, everything in this space might have one label, but this one's going to have this other more secure label because I'm really worried about it. But I want to make sure it's shared. I want to do my due diligence, right, and be a good steward for effective collaboration and retention and knowledge management and everything else. So this is why something like Caligo becomes a critical tool within your toolkit, because it solves this gap between Outlook and Teams, Outlook and SharePoint, et cetera. Now, this isn't limited just to the filing. It's also, and management of these emails and content related to it. It's also very useful for even exploring that content, because as you can imagine, having things like pinned locations and having the ability to quickly consume and view metadata and the content, that's very useful in Outlook and in Teams itself, right? So having experiences both in Teams and Outlook where you can quickly navigate across the various places that you work and be able to see and interact with that content becomes very valuable, because I don't know if you know this, Teams itself has a bunch of challenges with navigation, which we'll come back to. Another example here, I've talked about metadata a lot, where we either did default metadata or we did sort of individualized choice metadata where they make a decision. But it's also really important to understand that automatic metadata is already here and available to you as well. Now, automatic metadata, typically we talk about this in the context of SharePoint syntax, and that's what I'm going to do today, is talk about the two methods. But really the key is when you take a document and you drop it into a library that's syntax enabled, it can either interpret the document by opening it up and reading it. The AI literally reads the document and says, oh, okay, this word and then this word show up in this pattern. So that means that this is probably this kind of contract, and that this, I should extract like the expiration date for the contract when it's good till. I should extract the different parties that are involved. I should extract who signed it. Like all of those values can then be extracted and then put as metadata, which can empower processes. In my example there for an NDA, I might use that. And I do this actually today quite a bit, where I know that an NDA is going to expire. So I need to make sure I do something about that before it expires with a strategic customer or someone else, for a partner like Caligo that we're working with as an example. Similarly, if we think of forms processing, what that is just a different way of doing document understanding, where essentially you have a document that has a very consistent structure and you map those fields. So for simplicity and sake of time, I'm only showing forms processing here, but do understand there's a lot of complexity that Microsoft has. They are an incredibly robust solution set for doing this extraction. So here you can see what it's doing is it's looking at like the vendor, the ship to, the amounts. It's extracting that data, and then it's putting it into columns, right, in metadata, so I can use that for processes, so I can use that for search, so I can use that for views and other kinds of experience layers that I want to use it for. And of course, for, as you guessed it, compliance and labels and security as well. So this is really, really powerful, this capability from Microsoft. It is an extra license cost, so it's worth considering, but it's something that you really should understand, because a lot of customers have felt for years that this sort of AI understanding of documents is inaccessible or too expensive. It is not. It is extremely, extremely accessible and low cost today compared to where it was. Another example here is that classifying the content. I've mentioned all this stuff about kind of automating it. Well, you can actually look at that yourself. If you're not familiar with it, in the back end of the Compliance Center, compliance.microsoft.com, you can actually go look at your content in your own organization. This is an example of an organization in our organization, and then other data, where you can actually see we have a lot of medical terms and conditions. We have addresses, we have specialized tax identification numbers and things like that that apply in our organization based on the areas that we work in, right? Canada especially. So we use that data today actually to help us understand how big is the risk today, right? Are we managing the content effectively? So data classifications, especially the Content Explorer, can be such a great tool to understand how much are you leaving on the table, right? In terms of risk that you're not managing, that you're not understanding your content well. And you can, of course, get into things like activity and how are the activities correlated to, these things as well, to help define your labels, to help define your label strategy, and most importantly, define your metadata and long-term information architecture strategy, which will automate all of this in the first place. If you wanted to even use the automation, I know I mentioned I am a big fan of using metadata first. You can even use things like automatic labels. So you can do things like an auto label policy where specific terms are shown up. This is one where we did it in Microsoft when I was working with the Microsoft HoloLens team. Before HoloLens was public, it had a different code name, and that code name essentially shouldn't show up anywhere. So if it showed up, we would automatically protect that content. That's why when HoloLens was announced a few years ago, it was such a big deal. People had never heard of it because it was kept under tight wraps, which is wonderful to see. So things like that are things that you can control, and you can use automation, but it's important to understand that this automation always has like catch points, things where it's going to struggle to do a certain degree. And so that's where that metadata becomes so critical for kind of closing that last mile gap. Another thing that's interesting is this automation isn't limited to just like the sensitive info, specific words or classifiers. You can also do that actually over here on the right, where you look for things like confidential project names, threatening language, inappropriate content, etc. And you can actually also apply different rules for that, whether it's Teams IMs, whether it's emails, whether it's file content, etc. So it's important to understand that compliance has really robust solutions from Microsoft, first-party ones that work with these technology sets. But I mentioned earlier, hey, we have variety. It's not just that we have this, but we have a bunch of other technologies. How does that work with this strategy? Well, the good news here is yes, almost every customer has multi-cloud, so you're not alone. Number two, almost every customer that we talk to has a challenge with protecting data across cloud platforms. The thing is most don't realize or recognize it, so that's something else to work on. That's why the 27% is lower, but this is a big area to investigate. So naturally, I'm biased. My suggestion is to not use these less compliant, less secure tools, less effective employee experiences and user experience tools. I have very strong feelings about many of these tools. So use them less and use Microsoft more. Okay, well, that's one way to potentially solve it, but this doesn't solve it for many organizations because this is a multi-year journey. Should I have redundant investments in Google and Microsoft? No, right? Like we should eventually be consolidating, but sometimes you acquire a company and they have a bunch of these tools like Slack, et cetera, and you're working on that transition strategy. So during that transition strategy, or just in general, if you're trying to be more compliant, keep in mind that Microsoft is a first-party citizen here who's trying to be a steward of that, and they actually have data connectors that connect to 60 plus or 70 plus of these different tool sets, for these vendor tools that we use a lot of times in our organizations, that allow us to archive, to pull the data in, and then do all the compliance stuff we were talking about with that data. So I can do things like a legal hold, or I can do e-discovery, right, with that data, even though that data is in other systems. And I can use the same tooling that I'm using with Microsoft. So I have one sort of consolidated compliance journey, which is an important distinction here, instead of having a fragmented one, or one that's highly reliant on third parties that may not be as robust, right, in terms of their due diligence. So again, if you didn't know this, this is only one way to connect these tools. You can connect them in Teams, you can connect them in Outlook. There's lots of other ways to connect these tools as well, but I wanted to at least talk about the compliance connection because I think it's one people underestimate. One last aspect to this, I have not really talked about applications. We all have legacy applications, business process applications, other things that we use today, where there's collaboration occurring, and those legacy apps are terrible, and we hope that they're moving away from them over time, right? So as we modernize those legacy apps, I want to really encourage you to build those, with Microsoft 365, because if we do that, then we inherit the capabilities of things like Microsoft Teams. We inherit the capabilities of the deep integration across the stack portfolio. We inherit things like fluid or loop componentry that allows for co-authoring at levels we never had before, connectors across all those systems that we mentioned, all the back-end stuff, right, on compliance and security, all that stuff is available to us as well. So again, if you're doing application modernization, obviously reach out to us, see if we can help you. But this is one that you certainly should, use as much as possible the Microsoft stack, because it's going to solve a lot of these problems of, scaling, collaboration, security, and other things like that.